Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Ask the Experts. I am Diane Southard, your DNA guide, and joining me today is Leah Larkin. So I'll just take a little minute here to read this bio that we've prepared here for Leah so you can get to know her if you haven't already. And then if you haven't been to our Ask the Expert series before, the way it works is I've got some questions I'm going to ask Leah, but I will be watching the chat. So if you have a question for Leah, you can put it in the chat and perhaps I'll slide it over and we can ask her your questions as well. So feel free to start putting your questions in the chat and I'll be watching for those as we go on throughout the next half hour or so together. So to introduce you to Leah, Leah began helping adoptees and others of unknown parentage as part of the Search Angel community, donating effort and expertise to help people help themselves, which of course is what we're all about here at Your DNA Guide as well. Leah earned her PhD in biology from the University of Texas at Austin, where she used DNA to study the relationships among different species. She's worked in both academia and scientific publishing and applies those research skills daily to solving genealogical questions using DNA. She loves using DNA to solve family history mysteries and teaching others to do the same. Leah offers full research services. She blogs at thednageek.com. She runs several online genealogy groups and lectures internationally. She's also part of the fantastic team that has created the new tool called Banyan DNA, which of course we'll talk about. And she collaborates on new approaches for genetic genealogy, including the revolutionary What Are the Odds tool at dnapainter.com. So welcome, Leah.
Thanks for having me. It's such an honor to be here.
Oh, well, thank you. We are excited to hear from you today, but I want to just start kind of at the beginning of your journey and help everybody understand how it is that you ended up where you are today. So my first question really is pretty basic. Have you always been a science nerd?
Yes. As long as I can remember. I have always just loved kind of understanding how the natural world works. And that's what science is, right? It's how the world works. I was especially drawn to biology, I think in part because biology is its own discipline, but it also involves math and it involves chemistry and it involves physics. So it's all of kind of the core sciences drawn into one. I love learning new things, and there's always something new to learn in science. So there you go.
Right. I know. I love it. When I was thinking about this question for you, I was asking myself, have I always been a science nerd? And I think you hit on it a little bit. It's about a love of learning. And so I think anybody out there listening to us right now, you're like, oh yeah, not me. I'm not a science nerd, but I bet most of you have a love of learning. And I think that's the seed of being a really good science nerd. The other thing is data. I feel like I've always been, whether I knew it or not, kind of collecting data and like analyzing the world in like quantities and thinking, how does this work? Or what causes that or whatever. Anyway, so I think, yeah, in the end, I'm with you. I've always just had a little bit of love for the sciences. So tell us then, how did that love of science merge into a love of genealogy?
Well, to be honest, I came to genealogy late in life and also completely accidentally. My son actually had an assignment in middle school to do a family tree, and he finished it and moved on with his life, and I did not move on. I basically became obsessed. So for me, genealogy opened up like whole new insights into my own culture and my own background. And to be honest, I grew up kind of being ashamed of being Cajun. And genealogy gave me pride that I had not previously had. So, and then the science kind of came in later when I did my first DNA test, but I was already hooked by then.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Like, how did learning about who you were in more specific terms with genealogy help reverse shame into pride? What is that like?
That's a great question. So I think probably anyone who comes from a rural and predominantly farming type community gets stigmatized as being perhaps less intelligent, more backwards. You throw in endogamy and then you get to make crack jokes about, how distantly related everyone is. And when I started doing genealogy, I realized that my ancestors actually overcame incredible things and they were incredibly ingenious to do what they did. And I had not fully appreciated that.
So it was the story and knowing them as people instead of as this stigma that everybody else was assigning to them that you had adopted, and now they were real.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Well, Rhesus, I'm not sure if that's how you say it. Hellenistic genealogy research says that you're awesome. So it must
Thank
be true.
you. Blushing now. Thank you.
Okay. So I think many of our watchers today probably know you best from your work as a blogger from the DNA Geek. So tell us what that was like. Why did you decide to start this blog? Maybe why did you name it? Tell us a little bit about the history of this.
Well, the name was just obvious to me, the DNA Geek. That's me. I'm a nerd. I am a geek. I love my science. So that was just kind of like, it came to me and I was like, there's nothing else I could possibly call it. So I love teaching. I was in academia for a long time. I love helping people understand their DNA results. And before I started the website and the blog, I was mostly helping people online in Facebook groups. So Facebook groups for adoptees, people with unknown parentage. And Facebook is an odd medium, right? Because you can have a one-on-one interaction with someone and then it just gets buried under the feed of all of these other things, and it can be almost impossible to find it again. You can't always intersperse images the way you might want to convey a point. There's, weird communication. It's just a weird, it's wonderful, but it's also a weird venue.
Yeah.
I wanted a place where I could take my ideas and perhaps expound on them more thoughtfully, intersperse images to explain the points I was trying to make, write longer posts. And I also wanted something that would be easy to refer to again, so I could find it again. Even my own comments on Facebook, I can't find them. And so the blog came about mostly as a way for me to continue teaching.
So when was that moment where you realized, wow, people are reading this?
I'm not sure. It still kind of shocks me that people read my blog, because I'm just a nerd and I'm writing them a lot of times just to clear my own thoughts, to help me understand things better. I always find that teaching is one of the best ways of learning something.
Yes.
You never know what you don't know until you try to teach it to someone else, and then you're like, that didn't make any sense. I need to I need to go through the books and figure out what I'm missing here.
Did your background, I guess, in academia, and I find this with a lot of experts, but like, do you feel like it helps you or it hinders you in your ability to clearly explain to other people what's going on?
I think it helps. And I think it also helps having taught. I think if you only ever taught grad students, it might be different. But if you're teaching a lot of freshmen, and they're all coming from very different backgrounds, and they're all coming with very different levels of experience in whatever you're trying to teach them. And it's the same thing with the genealogy audience. Some people are pretty up to date on the DNA, and some people, this is like they've just done a DNA test and they're like, what? And so, I mean, for me, part of the fun of teaching is trying to explain something in a way that's going to reach the most people, but also not be so simplistic that the people who have more experience are just going to be like, that was dumb.
It is the constant struggle of teaching.
It's really hard, but when you get it right, it's really fun.
I agree.
I don't always get it right, but.
So one of the things that in the early days, I was always coming back to your blog for were the stats you started keeping on testing company numbers. So tell us a little bit about that, like watching that happen. And actually, I mean, for me, being the go-to person that we all went to, like how many tests has Ancestry sold, and that like journey that you helped me go on, like what was that like to kind of document that?
It's been amazing to watch the growth of the field, to see, especially in sort of 2018, 2019, maybe a little bit before that, right around then though, test kits were just skyrocketing. Like it was insane. At one point, I think, I actually keep more detailed stats on the background, but at one point I think Ancestry was adding something like 18,000 kits a day. Like it was insane. And so it's been really fun to see the growth of the field and to see my heritage come along from like nothing because they were late. They were late to get started and then they're doing so incredibly well. Anyway, it's fun to watch. It's fun to watch.
Right? It makes you I'm at least for me, and I'm sure it's the same for you. It's like having this document of all these years, and you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, were we really like still making like discoveries with that data?
I
And
know.
now we've got all of this, I just, yeah, it is really
I look back
exciting.
to sort of when I first tested, which was, I'm not great with time. So 2014, maybe. I'm not great with time, so don't quote me on that. But I look back at where the databases were then, and I'm like, and I thought this was amazing.
Yes.
We had such great matches, and like now all of those matches who were at the top of my list, I have to scroll really far down to find them.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Growth has been amazing. All right, let's start talking about endogamy. Do you remember when you first kind of learned about endogamy and what were your initial like learnings about this whole subject?
So I have I think this is kind of funny. So in Southern Louisiana, we have this saying that all Cajuns are cousins. And when I was growing up, I thought that was figurative. Like we are friendly people, we are a welcoming people. And I just thought that was symbolic of how we are kind of as a culture. And then I started doing genealogy and digging deeper into my family tree. And I'm like, no, that was really literal. We really are all cousins. We really are all related because we came from a small population. We migrated as a small population and we're really all related. And that's what endogamy is. And so at the time, I didn't appreciate, I'm not even sure I knew what the term was, endogamy. So I had to learn this new term and I didn't appreciate how it was going to affect genetic genealogy. So I think basically when I first did my DNA test is when I really started to appreciate what endogamy was and how it was going to complicate, well, everything.
Well, everything. Yeah. So that kind of brings us to endogamy is a genealogy and genetic genealogy challenge. So when did you start helping other people with their genealogy challenges? Like when did you move out of, oh, this is fun for me and I'm ready to help other people?
I think probably about 20 minutes after I got my test results, because I realized that I did not know enough. I didn't understand enough to figure out. So I originally tested because my great grandfather had a kind of mysterious origin. Supposedly he'd been born in France, come to Louisiana, where he fell in love with my great grandmother. And, the story continues. And my grandmother didn't know who his parents were. She didn't know where. She thought he came from Aquitaine, France. And I was like, this is how naive I was. I'm like, oh, I'm going to spit and tube and I'm going to figure out who his parents were in Aquitaine, France. And basically I get the results back and I'm like, immediately, that is not going to happen. That is not going to happen anytime soon. And I also don't understand DNA well enough to cut through all of this endogamy. So I started volunteering to help other people, in part so that I could teach myself, because I kind of learned by doing.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to learn how to, I think I started off selfishly, right? My goal was selfish. I wanted to learn how to do this so I could solve my Claude Lacoste mystery. And I fell in love with it. I fell in love with helping other people. I fell in love with teaching. It took me 4 years to figure out who Claude's parents were, but I did it, by golly. They were not from Aquitaine, France.
Of course not.
But I was totally naive. I was like, I'm a biologist. I'm reasonably intelligent. This is going to be easy. And it was really not easy.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I started helping people so that I could work cases and learn how you solve these problems when there isn't endogamy, with the long-term plan of learning how to solve the problems when there is endogamy.
Okay, I hope all of you were just listening to that, because that is a huge nugget. Two things really that I want to point out that Leah just said. One, she started helping other people so that she could learn different scenarios that were outside of her own family tree. which would then strengthen her ability to be able to answer the questions within her family tree. And that's true for all of us, whether you have endogamy or not. It became even more important for Leah because she had endogamy, and really the tools and the techniques that we use are different. But she decided it would be best to go out and learn from other people's case studies. And one of the best ways to do that is to help people. Just start interacting with people and say, what's your issue? Let me see if I can figure it out and help you. And you learn so much that way. So I love that that's an approach. Literally anybody listening here, you guys can all do that. You can all start just talking to more people, getting more exposure to more scenarios, and you learn so much by just doing. Yeah.
That circles back to what we were saying about learning by teaching.
Yes.
You try to, even if you're just trying to explain what a centimorgan is to someone, you're not planning on solving their parentage for them. You just want to explain what a centimorgan is. You will learn by trying to explain that to someone else.
Absolutely. All right, Carolyn has this question, Leah. I have 7 different lines of dentons on different lines on my mother's side. Is this considered endogamy?
Without knowing the exact origins of the family, I can't really say, but my guess is yes, that you've got endogamy there. Yeah. Assuming they're all, presumably they're all related at some point. So
right. Definitely. Okay, I think there was one more question I wrote down I wanted to pull. Oh, not yet. I'll save it. Okay. Next question is, tell us about your work with Jonny Pearl of DNA Painter and the WATO tool. How did that all come about? And maybe you should first start by just explaining quickly what is the WATO tool for anybody who doesn't know.
Okay, so the WATO tool is, so it's short for what are the odds, because it's a statistical approach. It's a little pun on statistics right there. Plus, I really liked the acronym WATO.
Yeah.
So it's a tool that lets you, so the simplest scenario would be if you were adopted and you have all of these DNA matches and you know how they fit into their family, you just don't know how you fit into their family. That tool lets you build out the tree for those matches. You plug in how much DNA you share with them, and the tool will basically say, we think this is the most likely place for you. And it might be right, it might be wrong, but it's a way to guide your next steps, to get you to your answer as quickly as possible. So as I mentioned earlier, I love math. And back in 2016, when I first started playing around with the idea, the best resource that we had for sort of gauging what a relationship might be was what we call the green chart, which was put out by DNA detectives. And it listed kind of the known ranges of shared DNA for different relationships. But what was missing that I could see was that it didn't give you probability. It didn't tell you which relationship was most likely. So for example, if you had a match of 300 centimorgans, which in 2016 would have been a pretty amazing match, but that could be a half first cousin. It could be a second cousin, but knowing that doesn't tell you which one of those relationships is most likely, because the one that's most likely is where you want to start dinging. And so knowing that, especially for multiple DNA matches, is really going to get you to your answers fastest. So also around that time, Ancestry put out what they call a matching white paper, which just explains the science behind what they're doing. And I had this figure that just struck me in this paper, figure 5.2. I got that memorized. And it was a graph that showed for different centimorgan amounts which relationship groups were most likely. And I loved this graph, but unfortunately it is on a logarithmic scale. And I don't know how many people know what that is, but it's not just like, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. It goes like 10 to 100 to 1,000. And it's really hard to just look at a logarithmic scale and interpret it easily. So at some point, I got the bright idea of plugging this into an online tool to figure out what all the values were. And I started using those numbers in my own sort of adoptee unknown parentage cases. So basically, if my client had a whole bunch of DNA matches and I knew how they were related, the math could tell me where my client might fit in that tree. This is a long story, but
no, it's awesome. I love it.
Okay, early on, I was literally doing all these calculations in a spreadsheet. I still have copies of that spreadsheet somewhere. Maybe, in another 10 years, I'll pull that out and we can all laugh at it. But it was an absolute nightmare. It was awkward. It was ugly. There was a lot of room for user error, and I made a lot of mistakes. And so I was doing this for a while, and then fast forward to 2018 when Jonny Pearl sort of burst onto the scene with his amazing DNA Painter website. And so Jonny is just a fabulous web designer, and he has a knack for taking really sort of complex ideas and complex concepts and making them not just easy to understand, but easy to use.
Yeah.
So collaborating with him was kind of like a no-brainer. I'm like, Jonny, I have this idea. I have this data. How can we put this out there for the world to use? And so initially he took the probabilities and he sort of layered them onto Blaine Bettinger's data in the shared centimorgan tool. So the averages and the ranges come from Blaine Bettinger. The probabilities come from that ancestry data set. And then later he built the framework for the what are the odds tool. So you didn't have to worry about whether you were calculating the relationships, right? And then you didn't have to go manually look up the probabilities in my little table. It does all of this stuff for you. So working with Jonny has just been a amazing asset to the entire genealogy community. Plus he's a super nice guy. So
right. Totally. Yeah. Okay. So Tom has a question here. So you mentioned that to use the WATO tool, we need a group of matches that are all related to each other. So Tom says he's got that. He wants to know, how seriously should you take these low centimorgan count matches that you're all connected to? So tell us, just kind of in general, answer his question, then tell us how WATO would or would not help with this kind of lower centimorgan situation.
So in general, the challenge with matches who don't share large amounts of DNA is that there are just lots and lots and lots of possible relationships. So the way WATO and the shared centimorgan probabilities work is, the more DNA someone shares, the fewer options there are. For a match of 3,500 centimorgans, there's only 2 possibilities, right? They're your parent or they're your child, or I suppose they could be your parent's identical twin, but there are not many possibilities. For a match of 40 centimorgans, there are probably hundreds of possible relationships that person could be. And so just knowing 40 centimorgans is not, it's narrow, it's ruling out, say, aunt, uncle, or maybe first cousin, but there's still so many possible relationships that just knowing you share 40 centimorgans can't tell you a lot about how you're related to them. The more DNA matches you can throw at the problem, which is one thing WATO can do, the better off you are. But ultimately, if you're trying to identify an unknown parent or an unknown grandparent, you're going to want closer matches.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So now tell us how we evolved from this WATO probability tool into Banyan, and like, what was that journey like?
So Banyan DNA is a new tool we just launched at Roots Tech. That was our official launch. And so WATO is fabulous, but the one thing WATO can't do is double relationships or multiple relationships. It can't really do endogamy. And that's because it's using this data that Ancestry generated. And when Ancestry generated that data, it's computer simulated data. But when Ancestry generated that data, they assumed that everyone was related only once. So they generated data for second cousins, but people who were just the second cousins once over. And if you come from an endogamous population, or even if you have pedigree collapse in your tree, if you've got a situation where 2 brothers married 2 sisters, that doesn't apply to you. So WATO is assuming that everyone's related only once. It works really well if that's true for your tree, but if it's not true for your tree, then WATO is not really the best tool. But until recently, we didn't have an alternative tool to use. So the idea for what is now called Banyan DNA originally came from Margaret Press, who convinced Professor Bill Press to write this computer program that does what we need, which is to actually simulate the data on a tree that you give it. So that tree can be as complex as you like. It can have double cousins. It can have, brothers marrying sisters. It can have endogamy. Well, we're not quite ready for that yet, but we will be someday. But it simulates the data on the tree you give it, and then it does the statistics in the background. So all of this kind of came about because of Margaret Press and Bill Press. But the problem with that tool, it's called CM Checker. And the problem with that is that you pretty much have to know how to program to be able to use it. It has no user interface. You have to basically write out a script. And if you put a comma in the wrong place, or if you set up your script wrong, it's not going to work. And you also need a pretty solid math background to interpret the results. So Margaret reached out to me again, I'm not great with time. I think this was 2020. Because of my own interest in endogamy and in math. And so I got access to Bill's program. I use it. And I realized this is ground shaking. This is revolutionary. This is going to change how we do genetic genealogy. But oh my golly, it needs a user interface. No one, the target audience for this tool is never going to be able to use it. So eventually, Margaret and I brought on a statistician who's named Mike Charleston, who is in Tasmania. And we brought on a couple of really savvy young computer developers, programmers named Jared Campbell and Carson Wild. And here we are. We have a user interface. Our user interface lets you build the tree easily. It lets you plug in all the DNA matches, and then it basically does all the gory stuff, sends the data over to Bill Press's program that's running in the background, and then spits out the results for you. So it's really been a team effort from the get-go.
Yeah, it is such a collaboration. And I love the story of how Banyan came together, because I think it represents what is needed now for this next level of DNA experiences and DNA tools that we need to develop. And I feel like and not that it was easy getting to this point, but I feel like all the easy tools have been made, right? Like we have all the things that help us do all the stuff that most people need to do at the foundational level, but there's all of this stuff that is complicated, and
Yes.
Families are different and complicated and twisted and mixed up, and we need more tools to help us. And I'm really excited about Banyan and about its potential. And I know you guys are just at the beginning of all the things that you have planned for it. And it's a really exciting thing. And I love that idea that not one person could have made this tool. That's the thing, right? It needed all of you and all of your different skills. And I just think it's inspiring. So Angel has this question. She's used both WATO and Banyan. She has it narrowed down to 2 people. Will I ever know exactly which one is the mystery great grandfather? P.S. Pedigree collapse is part of the challenge.
So the further back in generations you go, the harder it is to get an answer with absolute certainty. So it's hard to give you a yes/no answer to that. It's going to depend in large part on the matches that you can throw at it. The more people that you can test in your immediate family or your close family. So I guess you're looking for an unknown great grandfather. So the more descendants of your grandparent you could test, and then the more descendants of those 2 candidate men that you can test, the closer you'll get to an answer. And sometimes you might have to just accept, hey, there's a 95% chance it's this guy, and it's still 5% the other guy, but I'm okay with 95%.
Yeah. All right. And just tell people really quickly. So we'll put a blog post in the chat here that we did comparing WATO and Banyan, but just tell us what's the difference between these 2 tools that are similar.
Right. That's a great question, because they do very similar things. So, and as we've kind of already covered, both of them let you try out different scenarios where you're trying to, for the most part, figure out where you might fit into the tree of your DNA matches. And we call each potential spot you might fit a hypothesis, and runs some stats, compares those hypotheses to tell you which one is the most likely. But again, as we've also sort of covered, they go about it differently. WATO has kind of a static statistical table that makes these assumptions that there's only one relationship between different people, whereas Banyan is customizing the analysis for you. So it actually has to run calculations. You build the tree, you plug in the DNA matches, then you actually have to click a button, and it's going to run calculations on your computer, when you tell it to. That takes a little more time. Like WATO gives you results instantly. Banyan DNA, you actually have to run analyses, but they're pretty fast because Bill's program is it's a very clever program that is able to do these calculations really quickly. So that's one way these two things compare. WATO can suggest hypotheses for you. So you don't have to have any preconceived ideas of where you fit in the tree. You just plug in the DNA matches and say, hey, tell me where I might fit. Banyan can't do that. How else can they compare? The latest version of WATO Plus, actually has some really nice features for trying to identify, as opposed to just a parent, but an unknown grandparent or unknown great-grandparent. So it can factor in the fact that, hey, my grandmother was born in 1922 and I'm looking for her father. It can factor in ages if you tell it to. So it will, downweight a father who would have been 15 at the time and give more likelihood to a father who was 35. So it's got some really great features in that respect. And again, by contrast, Banyan's has basically two main strengths. One of them is that it can account for all these double relationships. And another thing that it can do is that it can actually check the overall accuracy of your tree. Even if you don't have any like known mysteries, you just want to plug in, and especially if you have access to multiple DNA kits, you can plug in your DNA matches for, in my case, like my mom and my uncle and their cousin and their other cousin, and all of the DNA matches between those people and the larger, more extended family. And I can ask Banyan, hey, does all of this make sense? Or is maybe someone out there a half sibling when I thought they were a full sibling? And depending on the matches, Banyan DNA can analyze everything all at once and then give you some insights into whether your tree actually stacks up to the documentation that you have. And yeah, to be honest, I use both. I use both on a regular basis.
Yeah, agreed. They both are strong and they are similar but different enough that you probably will use both, especially if you have a complicated family tree, you're going to want to use Banyan. All right, our last question today is, tell us, why is this work so important to you?
That is another great question. I think in part because I love science so much and I love learning and I love teaching and I love helping people, and this work that I get to do every single day combines all of those things. And I also get to work with some amazing colleagues. And I think you alluded to this earlier, knowing that we are building a foundation that the next generation of tool developers is going to be able to build upon to give us even better tools, more sophisticated tools. I would love 10 years from now to look back on Banyan and say, wow, that was so archaic,
Yeah.
I would love to see that. And to knowing that we are helping to establish this foundation is both, it's something I'm really proud of, and it's also really humbling.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel that a lot. And I feel the importance of each of us. One of the things, again, that I'll just reiterate about the way that Banyan has come to be is that each of you has these individual talents that you've combined together to create something new. And I hope that anybody who's listening to this realizes that you have that individual talent as well. You have something that needs to be contributed, and it could be within your own family. Maybe you don't go and make a website and a brand new tool, but each of us has this tool, has this talent within us that can help create something that's foundational to the next step, whatever that is. And so I love that story. I love the story of Banyan. It makes me feel like we've all got something to contribute, and it can really have an impact on what we're doing here. So
that's so
lots of great comments here in our chat. Lots of people with a rah, hooray. We're excited to have a tool that can help us with these complicated situations, and it is really exciting. So thanks, Leah, for joining us today on Ask the Experts. And thanks to each of you for showing up and joining us here, for all of your great questions. We are excited to be bringing you all of these experts to help you learn a little bit more about what's possible and what's already happening in our fabulous world of genetic genealogy. So you can join us next month on Ask the Experts. Our guest will be Scott Fisher. of Extreme Genes, or formerly, I guess, of Extreme Genes, who used to run that program. So we'll be talking with Scott in May. But in between then, we are doing another YouTube live event on DNA Day, which is the 25th of April. We're just going to be having some fun hosting a little DNA quiz show and karaoke. Our guests will be Drew Smith, Blaine Bettinger, and Judy Russell. So if you're already signed up to get alerts from our YouTube channel, you'll be alerted when we go live. And if you're not, you can click that little kind of bell button on our YouTube channel and start to get alerts. That way you'll be alerted when we go live with our DNA quiz show on the 25th. So thanks again, Leah, for joining us, and thank all of you for joining our Ask the Experts, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.